Hi, class. Professor Ormsby here. I'm not sure if you can see me or not. There's a little little recording of me off to the side. I think you're just seeing my slides here at this point. So this is going to be a brief lecture about some of the key concepts that I want to talk to you about today, this week. And also, these are concepts that are going to come up over and over again over the course of the semester, and I need to be able to use these terms in order to have the conversations that we're going to have. So, in other words, I'm going to kind of be throwing some concepts and vocabulary at you, and it's okay. I want you to give yourself permission to not fully understand 100% of all of the concepts that I'm going to talk about, with the understanding that as the semester goes, that you're going to get better and better at these concepts. So today my purpose is to just introduce you to them. I do want to point out that most of these are pretty abstract. Not all of them, actually, but there's a good portion of them that are pretty abstract. And so it raises the difficulty of understanding immediately. But that's okay. That's just right? Remember what we talked about in the first video, that I'm really about, as a professor, learning. And you learn by pushing yourself and trying to understand new things and trying new ideas out. So that's sort of what this is going to be about. Okay? If you have any I'm going to say this several times during the course of the lecture. If you have any questions or comments, just put them in the discussion that goes along with this video, the comments below. Okay. So let's talk just first, because this is our first sort of recorded lecture. So I just want to point out a couple of things that, again, we come with different skill sets to the class. So for some of you, this is obvious, and for others, it may not be. Really try to not transcribe what I'm saying. It's a very ineffective way to take notes. Not just because it's too slow, but because it actually inhibits your learning. It's actually why it's bad to take notes typing. So you should be writing your notes by hand. All of the research about both comprehension and retention, literally all of it, it's never been contradicted by research yet. You should be taking notes by hand. What your brain needs to do is listen to the lecture, analyze it, interpret it, and then the notes you take are putting it in your own words. Often including comments of your own that are not directly from the lecture, but are you thinking about the lecture. And all of the research, again, shows that that's the most effective way to take notes, both for retention and for comprehension. Now, because we're doing this online and I'm recording the lectures, which is a bit irritating, from time to time during lectures, I'll give you some thought questions, and I'll just ask you to pause the video and to take a minute to write it down in your notes. Write down the answers. The goal of writing down those answers is not to be right. It's to work with the ideas that we're dealing with. That, again, will anchor them in your brain and will increase retention and comprehension. I won't always answer the questions that I give you because that's not the point of them. Okay? Sometimes I will, but sometimes I won't. Then there's always the possibility of asking questions and making comments on the discussion on Canvas. And then, as I mentioned, I think in the first video, I'd be totally willing to have larger online discussions with anyone who wants to via Zoom. We just would have to schedule that. Okay? So those are the strategies that I recommend for the semester. Now, I would like you to take a few minutes and pause the video and answer these questions. So I'm going to say a few things before you do that, though. We're speaking English, clearly. At least I am. That doesn't mean that it's the first language of everyone in the room. the virtual room, since we don't have a real room. It does mean, though, that all of the history, all of the baggage of the word nature is sort of carried every time we say the word in English. And if English isn't your native language, some of this will not be obvious to you. If another European language is your native language, like German or Spanish, then you also, even in your first language, have the same baggage that English has. So European languages came about, the modern European languages came about with particular history of cultural ideas of what nature is. And so we use the word in really peculiar ways that can prevent us from understanding the concepts of the course. So these 4 questions, if you just take a minute, pause the video, and just write down in your notes what comes to your mind, what you think of in English or any other European language when you hear or say the word nature. What is it? How do you know what it is? That's a very important question. How do you know what nature is? How do you know when something is natural? What is your or our, as humans, relationship to nature? And then, does nature matter? Okay? So just pause the video, take a few minutes, and write your answers to those questions down. Okay. So what we want to talk about first, now that you've got nature in your head, you're thinking about that. Now we want to talk about the other side of the name of the course. So remember, our course is called Nature and World Cultures, and I'm gonna shorten that to Nature and Culture for most of the semester. Even though you'll notice that we are talking about cultures outside of the United States almost all. So we want to think about this semester what the relationship is between culture and nature, right? And then we also want to think about the relationship between culture and Homo sapiens. So Homo sapiens, if you don't know, I know most of you do, but maybe some of you don't, Homo sapiens is the species and genus name of us, of human beings. So I want to give you what I call my social science training wheels. These are basic beginning, fundamental, ground level ways to think about things. So this semester we will be talking not just about culture, but also society. As a social scientist, I would argue that the two are inseparable. You can't really talk about them separately. And then as the course goes on, you'll really see why I believe that. But what I want to do is to give you definitions of the two, just baseline definitions, so you can think about it. So for culture, in our class, we're going to mean beliefs, practices, and objects. Beliefs, practices, and objects. So let me clarify some of that. Beliefs, anything in your head, right? Ideas, thoughts, memories, anything in your head. Anything in any human's head. Practices, anything humans do. Actions with our bodies. Okay? And objects. So the actual material or physical things in the human universe that humans make, use, or give meaning to, including our own bodies and other humans. So beliefs, practices, and objects. Society, on the other hand, it's related, and I'm going to talk about how they're related in just a minute. So again, training wheels for society, also 3 things: interaction, institution, and power. So I'm going to talk about interaction a lot in a minute, but for right now, what you want to think about, what you want to get in your head, is that there's no such thing as a human, as a Homo sapien, who doesn't interact with other humans. So it's a kind of a strong statement, and I'll let you think about that for yourselves. Like, why and how is that true? Humans, by definition, interact with other humans. Now, we're also going to be talking about how humans interact with nature, but that'll come up in just a minute. So that's interaction. And then institution. Humans build structures that guide how they live. Sometimes those structures are very obvious institutions, like San Jose State University is a very obvious institution. Other institutions are actually less obvious. They happen in practice. So this isn't the way you're probably used to thinking it, but teacher-student, that relationship is institutionalized, meaning it has a set of rules that guide the beliefs, practices, and objects of that relationship, of that interaction. Okay? So institutions are structures of human interaction through rules. We build rules of how to interact. Power. The easiest way to start with power is maybe something that you guys just know intuitively from living, and that is humans are not equal to each other. Humans build societies that are unequal. Humans build relationships and interactions that are unequal. No exceptions. So I would love to hear your ideas for what those exceptions might be. But in my 20 years of being a social scientist, I have never encountered one. Power is actually very hard to define. I would love it if you would try. Like, you can pause now and try to define power in your notes. But for our purposes today, the main thing that I want you to know is that power is known by its effects or its consequences. So power is often invisible to us until we see its effect. Okay? So culture, beliefs, practices, and objects, society, interaction, institution, and power. And what you find, what social scientists, I won't say universally, but the vast majority of social scientists see those two things as being inextricably connected. They cannot be separated from each other. Okay? There's just, one doesn't exist without the other. But what we do as scientific thinkers, and actually just as humans, this is something human brains do. What we do is we divide the world up into categories so we can think about it. So in real life, beliefs, practices, objects, interactions, and power are all happening at once. But in order to think about them, what we do is divide them into pieces. We divide them up into categories. Okay? Questions in the comments. So pause the video for a second and just see right now, at this point, at the beginning of the semester, what you would say is the source of culture. And let me give you one hint before you pause to answer the question. I'm not asking you where you learned culture. So I think all of us watching the video now know that culture is learned. That we learn it from our parents, from other humans around us. That's not the answer to the question of where culture comes from. Where does culture come from? So pause the video. Okay, I'd like you to just sort of have that in your mind. We're not going to answer that today, but over the course of the next 5 weeks, we're going to answer that. It's a very complicated thing, so it takes a while to build up to the answer. Now, we come in this classroom, because this classroom is in the US, and the US is a sort of descendant of Western European culture. We come to the questions of nature and culture with a lot of baggage from Western Europe. Okay, so Western culture is what it's often called. That's really problematic because on a sphere, what the hell is West? What gets separated out? What counts as West? Is Brazil West? It comes from Portuguese culture mostly, but is it West? Like, are you guys kind of following what I'm saying? So the concept of Western culture is a problematic concept. But what I want you to know is that there are dominating ideas that came from Western Europe, especially from Germany, France, England, and Holland, and to a lesser degree, Spain and Portugal in North America. Unless you're from Central America, and then a much greater degree, Spain. And those ideas can be blocks to us to answering the questions of the course. So we want to start the course with a critical examination of Western culture, Western views of nature. What does the West think nature is? So I want to show you quickly. You should, maybe you've already read this before this discussion, before you're watching this video, but you have a document that's assigned to read this week by a professor of environmental studies, environmental history. I can't remember his first name, but it's Professor Barnhill. And what he did is he made this handout for his students that I just find fantastic, that summarizes the history of the Western European views. So I'm just scrolling through, and you'll see that he has it sort of outlined for you historically, with the historical categories of the shifts in culture. Okay, so be sure that you read this carefully, and as you read this, ask yourselves critical questions. Do I believe this, or was I taught this? Okay, and then there's another question that I'd like you to think about as you read. If I believe this, how would I behave? So notice two pieces of culture there, right? Belief and behavior. If I believe this, how would I behave? Okay. So I might come back to that in just a minute, but let's come back to our slideshow. So the first thing you want to know, I don't know if you guys can see me on the recorded video, but I'm lifting my hands over my head. So wherever you are, even if you're in the library or in the coffee shop, lift your hands up in the air, and then everyone lean to the left. I know you're not doing this, but you really should do it. We're doing something called kinesthetic learning. So you lean to the left, and then as you say the phrase change over time, you move to the right. So you say change over time, and you swing your arms to the right. So we're using our bodies in a very primary school sort of way to learn what history is. History is the change over time. So if we apply that to nature, the idea of nature, we would say that the view of nature, the idea of nature, has changed over time. It has not been consistent. People whose cultures derive from Western Europe have views of nature that have changed over time. Our own views of nature in our own lifetimes change over time. They're historical. I really hope that for some of you, this class over this semester might even slightly change the way you see nature as you become more critically engaged in the conversation. Now, in Western Europe, one of the things that makes it such an irritating but also really interesting culture to talk about is that the Western view of nature is dualistic. What that means is really, the simplest way to say that is that it's divided in two. And so you'll notice in the Barnhill reading, as you go through it, that he just kind of goes back and forth between these two contradictory ideas. Okay, let's keep going. Look, see, I'm so smart. I said it before it came up on the slideshow. It's contradictory and conflicted. So that duality, that it's always divided in two for whatever reason, is conflicted and contradictory. So for those of you who are environmental studies majors, and then some of you might just know some American history, the history of preservationism versus conservationism is an example of a contradiction in the view of nature. It's a contradiction in the idea, or a conflict in the idea of how nature is seen. That's especially true back in the 1890s when those two ideas were sort of being created. Now, there are two kinds of dualism in the Western view of nature, okay? So two kinds of binary splits or splits in two. And here's where we're going to get kind of philosophical. And again, these are concepts that if you don't get them on the first try, it's okay. But do the best you can for today. So the first kind of dualism is ontological dualism. Ontological dualism. Okay. So ontology, a Greek word, which all European languages use in their own forms. Ontology is existence or being. Existence. You might even say, so now I want to point out to you, I want to say it's the nature of things. Notice how English already, if I'm going to describe the ontology of nature, the best way to say it is it's the nature of things, which begs the question. So I wanted to point that out to you because it's an example of how English, the history of English is preventing us from having it, or it's not preventing, but it's making it difficult for us to have this conversation. Ontology is existence. It's the nature of existence. But if we want to study the nature of the existence of nature, notice we have a problem linguistically. Okay. Now, what we're saying dualistically is that at any given time in Western European views of nature, they actually had two contradictory ideas of the existence of nature. Okay? So some of that will make more sense if you've read the Barnhill or after you've read the Barnhill. Now the second one is a little bit easier, ethical dualism. This is much, I think the easiest way to think about this is that you have two different ethical propositions or ethical arguments or ethical rules for dealing with the same thing, nature. So if you see a giant sequoia, a preservationist is going to have a different ethical interpretation of the giant sequoia than a conservationist would, especially again in the 1890s. Okay? Or if I think today, I grew up in Klamath County, Oregon. Some of you may know where that is, where there's a long history of disputes and really angry conflicts over the ethical use of water, fish, trees, farmland, wetlands. And you basically find that the people of the county are divided on their ethical stance toward the ecosystem that they live in. That's it. So there's that sort of that dualism. Now, I want to use another word called naturalism this semester, and I want to point out to you that naturalism means, it's a word that means about 6 or 7 different things. And so especially if you're an environmental studies major, you might have a professor who uses this word differently from me. And so you just have to have have your ears up and know that this word means many different things. So just be aware of how professors and other people are using it. So I am using this in a philosophical sense. It's from an American philosopher named John Dewey. I don't care if you know who he is, but I'm just getting his name out there. And he argued for a naturalistic interpretation of human life. And what he meant by that is that, very simply put, everything that we think humans are, everything that we know about being a human, including, random shit like Britney Spears and, Chicken McNuggets. Everything that we think we know only exists in interaction with, Dewey said, nature. I want to be a little more specific, and I would say interaction with ecosystems. So notice I'm using that word interaction that we got with society. So interaction with nature now. So now we're not just interacting with people. Now we're interacting with cats and the squirrel sitting on the tree outside of my window, the sun, the air, rocks, right? We're interacting. And what Dewey is arguing is that everything that humans are or think they are, all of their beliefs, practices, and objects, all of their interactions, institutions, and power are connected in a circuit of interaction with the ecosystem. That is, I think that is empirically true. So as a social scientist, I'm telling you, I think the research proves that. But you should also know that social scientists argue about this. So there are many social scientists who think that human brains, human cultures, are so powerful that they have disconnected us from the connection to the ecosystem. Okay? I don't think the evidence supports that. So I'm teaching you from my read of the evidence. But just know there's a debate, okay? So now we want to talk about what that relationship is between nature and culture. And all I'm doing today is sort of setting the groundwork. What I'm going to do over the next 5 weeks is build up the detailed argument for you. So if you want to think about it this way, naturalism, so here's the phrase I'm going to use in class: the naturalistic theory of culture. The naturalistic theory of culture. That's kind of my thesis, and I'm going to give myself 5 weeks to prove it to you. 5 weeks to show you why I think it's the best explanation for the relationship between nature and culture. Now, in English, in Western European languages in general, we have embedded in our language that humans and nature are separate from each other. Okay? So Western assumptions, going all the way back to the Greeks, has been that humans are separate from nature. Just as a little side note, and I think Barnhill does not do a good job with this, Barnhill sort of collapses monotheism into a Christian interpretation. So he gets Judaism and Islam wrong. But this does not come from Judaism. It comes from let me see if I can say this right. It's the Greek separation of humans from nature is carried forward by Christians interpreting Christianity through Greek philosophy. And that's a whole other class. So that's not this class. But that's just to kind of show you some of those historical connections. And then you'll get good descriptions, mostly good descriptions in the Barnhill. So I want to talk to you about something called HEP. HEP has 2 different meanings, but they're related to each other. So I'm giving you the acronym first. So if we just get in our heads that Western European cultures, including the Western Hemisphere, so North and South America, Western European cultures have embedded in the way they see the world this idea that they are separate from nature. Okay, so keep that in mind. Until roughly the 1920s, historians looking back at, so this is actually from American history, but it also maps well onto European history. So by American history, I mean the United States. So in U.S. history, until the 1920s, most Americans believed in what historians have started calling the human exceptionalism paradigm. It was, remember, in culture, belief, practices, and objects. It was their belief. Okay? Human exceptionalism paradigm. So what that means is, I don't know if you've ever thought about what exceptional really means. So we live in a stupid age, and I'll probably say this 3 or 4 times over the semester because it's a pet peeve of mine. We live in an era when advertising has ruined English. So words like exceptional don't mean anything anymore because in advertising, my dishwashing soap is exceptional. But when something is exceptional, it is an exception to the rule. It's outside, right? Our word accept comes from that, right? So if humans are outside, what are they outside of? They're not just outside of nature, but what human exceptionalism argues is that humans are different from nature, that they are not subject to the laws of nature. Humans cannot be studied or understood in the same way that nature can. Okay, so in other words, there was really a cognitive or a mental or a cultural, often a religious idea that just radically separated human beings from the rest of the natural world, from the ecosystem. Okay, now in the 1920s, it's kind of interesting because there was a big backlash against evolution in the 1920s. Really for the first time. So if you have a sort of idea that Christians were always against evolution, it's not really true. They don't start being against evolution until the 19-teens. And in the 1920s, there's a big backlash. But what's interesting is that when there's a big backlash against evolution on the part of evangelical Christianity, the rest of America is kind of like, okay, maybe human beings evolved. And so there becomes kind of a general acceptance. And so human exceptionalism paradigm transforms into the human exemptualism paradigm. Now, this is just one of the dumb things of language. Those look almost exactly the same. They could potentially, even the language there, they could mean the same thing. But what we're trying to do is to demarcate a transformation. Remember, history has changed over time, right? So in the 1920s, Americans began to believe not that humans were separate from nature, but that human culture was so powerful that we could think ourselves out of the consequences of our behavior. That culture could be used to save us from the consequences of our behavior in the environment. That we would be exempt from the consequences of natural law because we could come up with cultural solutions to the problems we create. Now, I'm guessing, because I've been teaching at San Jose for 12 years, I'm guessing that many of you might even still believe that. You might come from that school of thinking. A lot of environmental studies is kind of based on that. One of my goals this semester is not to disabuse you of the human exemptualist paradigm necessarily, although that would be great, but rather it's for you to become critical of it and to be open to challenging that idea that humans can simply use culture to get out of the consequences of their behavior. And so they're therefore not subject to the consequences of their behavior in the environment. In the 1960s, we get something quite different called the new ecological paradigm. And this is something that's also very prominent in environmental studies. And so there's in environmental studies, the exemptualist paradigm and the new ecological paradigm sometimes coexist. But I want you to problematize that this semester, to think critically about that this semester. So the new ecological paradigm arises in the 1960s when biologists started talking about ecosystems and ecology. Okay, so they started seeing biospheres, or not biospheres, biomes, ecosystems as systems. So for those of you who went to high school after about 1970, like I did, you already use these words. They're sort of built into how we think about biology now. But what I want you to know is that it was really radical in the 1960s to think of biological organisms existing in a systemic relationship of interdependence. That was new and pretty radical in the 60s. Now it's pretty normal. But what we want to talk about is that human scientists, people who study humans, started saying, wait a minute, if there's an ecosystem, then maybe humans are actually part of the ecosystem and not separate from it. Maybe humans are not, clearly humans aren't exceptional. Humans are biological. They did evolve like all other creatures on the planet. But maybe also we're not exempt. Maybe culture isn't separate from the ecology. Maybe culture isn't separate from the ecosystem. Maybe humans are deeply embedded in ways that we're even unaware. Maybe we do and say and believe things because of the ecosystem we live in. Maybe the ecosystem is shaping us as much as we are shaping the ecosystem. That's the new ecological paradigm. And just so you know, I'm teaching the class from that perspective. I'm teaching the class from the new ecological paradigm perspective. Okay? Any questions in the comments below? Now, as much as possible for the first 5 weeks of class, I'm going to try to avoid using the word nature. Because nature is so fraught with so many problems, so much baggage, which you're going to read about in the Barnhill reading, I'm going to say either the biophysical world is one of the ways. So I say biophysical because I want to emphasize that it's not just living things, but rocks and soil and air and water are also part of the world that we interact with. So biophysical world, or I'll just use the biology word ecosystem. But when I say ecosystem, I want you to always know that I mean the non-living entities also. So things like rocks and dirt and shit. Okay. So if you need to take a breath, get up and stretch. That's great. Take a pause on the video. I believe this is the last slide. I shouldn't say that because I actually, it's hard to remember when it's sort of up on my screen. These are concepts that lay the foundations for understanding evolutionary theory. Okay, so far during this lecture, we've covered the concept of nature, and my goal has been to try to get you to start thinking critically about the idea of nature, to make it so you don't just assume that you already know what nature is, but maybe be open to changing your idea of what nature might be, and also what culture and humans are. Okay, now we're shifting gears to talk about evolutionary theory. Okay, so first, let me see if I can pull this up for you. Again, you have an assigned reading. So you're just looking at my screen here. So when you pull the assigned reading up, you have a little pamphlet. It's a very easy read called Science, Evolution, and Creationism. It's put out by the National Academy of Sciences and the Institute of Medicine. And it's meant to sort of give people who need it a primer in why evolution matters and how it relates to society and religion. So I've assigned this reading. Everyone should read it. This is a fast read. It's like a 10-minute read. But I've assigned this reading because I'm teaching this class with the presumption that science is real and that science is so far, it's the best method humans have come up with for getting at the truth, for being able to explain the truth. So I teach this class from a scientific perspective, and I really have no patience for anti-science arguments. That doesn't mean we're not critical of science. In fact, science has critique built into it. What I mean is that I teach the class from a skeptical, not a cynical position. So skepticism is what science wants. It wants you to always be open to new evidence and to always be questioning. Cynicism is the refusal to believe evidence. And that's what we want to avoid. Now, I'm an odd person. I think I mentioned in the last video that I'm Jewish and I do practice a religion. But I'm not a theist. I don't believe, I'm an atheist, in fact. If religion has many different social and cultural functions, one of which historically is often to explain the natural world, the biophysical world, the ecosystem. And there are many reasons why humans who are rational and scientific might still choose to practice a religion. And I don't see, and the reason I'm telling you all of this is because I'm perfectly willing, not in a class setting, but if you want to talk about the relationship between religion and evolution, sort of separate from class, I'm willing to do that. But in the context of the class, we're going to be following the science, okay? So everyone read this. Again, it's like a 10-minute read. It's really great. It just sort of like lays the foundations that we're working from this semester. Okay. Yeah. So I'm trying to. I will mention this again next week, but clearly I'm a social scientist, so I don't have a PhD in biology. Evolution comes into my training and into my expertise because of how I believe human societies and cultures function. So my reading and understanding of human evolution is kind of like foundational for the actual research and thinking that I do in my own work. Um, what that means is I'm very good at evolutionary theory. I do try to keep up on the newest research in human evolution, but that's not my field of study, so sometimes I'm a little behind. And it also means I'm not an expert. Like I don't research this. So sometimes you might have questions, and I'll say we need to ask an anthropologist that, because I won't know. But I am very good at the theory. And like I said, I keep up on the research in human evolution. So for our purposes, I should be able to answer most questions. But just don't be surprised if I tell you like that's beyond my understanding. I don't know the answer to that. And then also, if you have been lucky enough to take the anthropology course in human evolution, you're going to have a lot more detailed knowledge than is going to be required for this class. However, I might be talking about more theory than was required in that anthropology class. So kind of pay attention to how those two things work together. All right, so these are now the foundational intellectual concepts of evolutionary theory and naturalism, which I defined earlier. Okay, so now we're taking that word interaction and we're making it into a belief. Interactionism, it's an idea, a theory. So interactionism is foundational to evolution, to evolutionary theory, to the theory of natural selection, and actually any kind of selection. We'll talk about multiple kinds of selection. Interactionism is sort of the assumption that you have in your head that everything that happens to an organism over its lifetime, which is history, right? Change over time, is interactional. The organism is in constant, inseparable interaction with its ecosystem, with its environment, if you will, if that's an easier word for you. And including other organisms, and in our class with humans, including other humans. That's also true of all other species, but I just want to point it out for humans specifically. So everything is always interaction. Evolution occurs because of constant interaction and constant change. And also, because we were talking about religion a minute ago, I just kind of want to point out that that's very Buddhist. The Buddhist idea of constant change, and the change is constantly happening because of constant interaction. So we just, even though we're talking science, we just spent a little bit of time in lotus position being the Buddha. Now, causality gets a little complex, and I don't want to, like you can take a whole philosophy course on causality. But what I want you to think about is that one of the questions of evolutionary theory is why, or what caused that? What caused that change? Okay? Causality is very hard to determine because of interactionism. Okay, so this is a kind of an intense thought question, but I would like you to pause and answer this question. Why does interactionism make it difficult to find the cause of evolutionary change? Okay, so hopefully you paused the video and answered that question in your notes. Just gave it a thought. Remember that your goal is not to be right in your answer. Your goal is to try to answer that question. By trying, it's like you're up on the bike, right? You're trying to ride the bike, even though you might fall over, and your answer to that question might be wrong right now, and that's okay. The point is that you tried. So notice, I apologize that I have the hiccups today. It's really irritating. Notice that what I tried to do is get you to take two concepts and put them together to create new knowledge in your own head. Now, the answer to the question is actually not very difficult, but it's okay if you didn't get it, right? It's just, but now that we've tried, the reason interactionism makes causality difficult is because any organism is constantly interacting with hundreds, if not thousands, of different possible causes. So determining which one thing caused it is often not possible. Now, there's a second reason that's actually not on the screen and that we haven't talked about, and that is that in evolutionary science, we find that many shifts over time in species actually have multiple causes, not just a single cause, but many different causes at the same time. Okay? Questions below, right? You're typing questions. Also, before you type your question, make sure that somebody else didn't ask the same question, because I'll just refer you if I've already answered it. So, what scientists do is they use probability. They use statistics. Okay, so they can do the statistics will either be looking for the cause, but that's really rare in evolution. So that's more common in physical sciences to look for the cause. Okay, or they look for the set of possible causes. Like what this is just an example, but what 3 things caused human brains to get so much bigger than chimpanzee brains? Right? So you're not looking for one thing, you're looking for 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 things that might have or probably did cause that. Okay? So we're dealing with a world of complexity. We're dealing with a world where there are multiple answers, multiple causes, multiple interactions. Now, to me, because I've been doing this for 20 years, that's super fun. I really like that. But I do want to say that I know, because I'm a teacher, and teaching is very important to me, that for many people, as they are introduced to these ideas, it's really overwhelming. There's a lot of moving parts. How do you keep track of it all? And so just keep reminding yourselves about complexity. Now, complexity also has, in biology and in physics and in social sciences, it has a technical meaning, which is less important to me for our class, but feel free to look up complexity in like an encyclopedia of philosophy, for example. And you might, and if it's interesting to you. So the last 2 concepts I'm going to teach you, these are abstract concepts, and they are almost everyone, including professors, struggle with them. Okay. So it's okay to take a few weeks to try to let them sit in and get them. So what I'm going to try to do today is to just give you the definitions, just so you can start. All right. So overdetermination comes from statistics. In fact, both of these 2 concepts that I'm going to teach you come from statistics. Overdetermination is when a phenomenon, anything that a thing that you're studying. So like I used the example of human brains. So why did human brains get big? Why are Homo sapiens brains so much bigger than any other mammal brain? Okay. Relative to body size, which, yeah, clearly my brain is smaller than a gray whale's, but we'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. So relative to body mass, why are human brains so gigantic? So what overdetermination says is that phenomenon, big brains, that phenomenon of big brains is so complex that the causality is overdetermined. Okay, so that's just how you use the language. I'm going to say that again. The phenomenon of big brains is so complex that the causality is overdetermined. Now, what overdetermination means is something that I think you'll get pretty quickly. Overdetermination says that there are multiple possible causes. Multiple possible causes, all of which have evidence supporting them. So we eliminate causes that have no evidence. We don't consider causes for which there is no evidence. Unless you're doing the science to find the evidence. Sorry, see, it's complex. All right, so again, let me say that again. Overdetermination is multiple causes